Okay, so we'll get started here. I just want to mention that we'll be recording this call, this conversation, and we'll be posting it later on our YouTube channel, on the WC YouTube channel. So you can find our YouTube content by going to infinitewc.ca and scrolling down to the footer, and we'll have all of our social links there, and YouTube is one of them. But I'd like to start off by saying I'm Patrick Earl. I'm the Economic Development Officer for Wheatland County. And I'd like to welcome you to our Small Business Week conversation with Todd Hirsch, Vice President and Chief Economist for ATB Financial. We've had Todd on our weekly Infinite Possibilities conversation back in June this year, and it's great that he's back to celebrate Small Business Week with us. So if you could mute yourself during his presentation if you're not and if you're not speaking, and it will help prevent any background noise on the call. And so for Todd is the Vice President and Chief Economist for ATB Financial. He holds degrees in economics from the University of Alberta and University of Calgary. For over 25 years, he's worked as an economist at numerous organizations, including the Canada West Foundation and the Bank of Canada. He is also the author of 3 books. His latest, Spiders in Space, Successfully Adapting to Unwanted Change, what was released in 2017. Todd is a strong advocate in the arts and culture community. He is the board chair for the Calgary Arts Academy and serves on the boards of the Glenbow Museum and the Alberta Ballet. And with that, I'd like to welcome you back, Todd, and super appreciate you sharing time with us.
Well, thank you so much, Patrick, for that very kind introduction. Thank you for having me back. Before we went live, Patrick and I were chatting, and we think it was back in June when I was talking to this group, or at least a group in Wheatland County. I'm not sure how many on the call were on that call, but that was back in June. Now here we are, middle of October, and the situation has changed a little bit. I'm going to open my presentation here. We'll see if I'm able to do this without too much trouble. Patrick, do you want to give me a verbal thumbs up, or if that looks okay?
You're good, Todd.
Okay, yep. Great. So the title of my presentation, What If It's Easier Than We Think? Alberta's Evolving Economy in a COVID World. Now that title, What If It's Easier Than We Think, that is a bit provocative. And it's meant to be. It's meant to get you interested, maybe raise your eyebrows, because certainly nothing about this pandemic and nothing about Alberta's economy right now feels easy. So I'm hoping I'm getting you intrigued by that title. What I want to do is spend the first kind of half of the presentation going over the current outlook, our forecast for 2020 and 2021, and then we'll dive into a few specific sectors. And then I want to shift gears and get back to this theme of what if it's easier than we think, the idea of evolving rather than recovering as we move through COVID. So with that, let's dive right into the economic outlook. Now, I'm not going to torture you with too many numbers, certainly no charts or graphs. There is one actually graph towards the very end of the presentation, but I'm just going to give a few of the headline numbers from our outlook. And if, by the way, you're interested in reading the full outlook, you can go to atb.com/economics, and the 2-page, the full report will be there. But just a couple of the brief headline numbers. We are expecting Alberta's economy in 2020 to contract by 7.1%. Now, I always caution us, let's not get too caught up in the 10th of percentage points. I always laugh at economists. We really do have some ego to believe that we can forecast to a 10th of a percent how much the economy is going to contract or expand in any given year. So, we don't get too caught up in that. And all of the other forecasts, the other private banks, the government of Alberta, all of the forecasts for Alberta are kind of clumped in that -6 to -9 range. And I don't think it's worth quibbling over, too much over the, if it's going to be 6.5 or 7.1. Suffice to say, this is going to be the single biggest year of contraction that any of us have lived through. You'd have to go all the way back to the Great Depression to find something comparable. And hopefully this will be the worst recession that we ever do live through. And obviously, it is because of COVID and the double whammy, the oil price contraction that was already underway before COVID. And then, of course, the pandemic, which shut down huge swaths of the economy. And now we are still crawling our way through the year. More hopefully, 2021, we are expecting some modest rebound or growth of 3.3%. Now, in a normal year, 3.3% growth for Alberta, that wouldn't be too bad at all. In fact, you've got to go all the way back to 2014 to find a year where growth was that strong. Actually, it was even stronger in 2014. But we've been now about 7 years with growth either in recession or in the years 2017, 2018, we did see some very modest growth. But 3.3% growth, our forecast for next year, would be the strongest rate of growth in 8 years for Alberta. So that sounds actually not too bad. But the more sobering reality is that even if we see 3.3% growth, that doesn't even get us halfway out of the hole that we've dug for ourselves in 2020. In other words, the size of our economy by the end of 2021 is still likely to be lower, considerably smaller than it was in February of this year. And I think that is the stark reality for the province, even with some modest growth. And there's some caveats, by the way, with that modest growth, which I'll get to. But even with 3.3% growth, it is still going to feel recessionary in the province, simply because our economy, on an absolute level, the size of it will still be smaller. And the caveats for that 3.3% growth, it does depend on a few things falling into place. One is that we don't see another shutdown of the economy like we saw in March. Now, it's hard to predict with, great certainty what's going to happen. We are, of course, seeing cases of COVID spiking in Alberta. I think the last couple of days we've set new records for daily cases. In other words, we're sort of back to where we were in March and April. In fact, the daily cases are even higher than that. So I wouldn't discount entirely if it's a province-wide or if it's by municipality, some re-lockdown of the economy. It might not be entire, but certainly things like gyms and fitness centers, things like personal services like hair salons and nail salons, things where it's really, really difficult to maintain that physical distancing. We might see those being required to close, maybe even the restaurants and stores. But why I'm hopeful that we won't see this happen is because, unlike March, we are much better in October of understanding what we need to do. Everyone today has a face mask. Not that everyone wears it all the time. Back in March, none of us had face masks. This was all brand new to us in March. We didn't know what to do. No one had personal protective equipment. We didn't understand the 2-meter physical distancing. In October, we've now had 7 months of practice with this, so it's not new to us. So even though cases are spiking again, as we expected they would, as we're in the second wave, I'm not convinced that we are going to see another lockdown of the economy. If we do see another lockdown of the economy, depending on how long that lasts, we might be revisiting our 3.3% growth for next year. But for now, we're not assuming a second lockdown. The 3.3% growth also requires those oil prices to hang in where they're at and maybe even strengthen a little bit in 2021. Our forecast is that we're going to see WTI back closer to around $50 US a barrel. Right now, it's been languishing around $40 US a barrel. If we are to see oil prices start to fall back down into that $25 or $30 range, again, that would put our forecast in jeopardy. But we are expecting some very modest strengthening of oil prices, simply because global oil supply has been curtailed a lot because of COVID and because of the weak price environment pre-COVID. We've seen a lot of global spending on new capital investments in energy being postponed or The US shale oils, for example, has been almost completely locked in. So because of that, we are seeing less supply coming onto the market in 2021. Now, we also have to consider weaker oil demand in 2021 because we are still in the middle of this pandemic. But on balance, we expect those oil prices to probably strengthen modestly, and that will help stimulate a little bit of spending in the energy sector. So that 3.3% growth forecast, it does come with those caveats. And like I said, I'd be very happy to revise it downward if in fact we feel it's necessary to do so. The other numbers I want to share with you, and these ones are a bit sobering. The unemployment rate in Alberta. We're expecting on average the unemployment rate to be 11.4% this year, falling only to 11% on average next year. Now, it's been a long time. You have to go back to the 1980s to see back-to-back years of double-digit unemployment in Alberta. Not even during 2015 and 2016 recession, we didn't see back-to-back years of double-digit unemployment. So this is really troubling news. And the unemployment rate, I always consider labor market indicators are probably, for most Albertans, this is probably the only number that matters for them. You know, economists and economic developers, we talk about GDP and we talk about manufacturing shipments and, you know, different statistics on retail activity. But for most Albertans, really the only thing that matters to them is, am I going to have a job? Or am I going to find work? Or are my kids coming out of university, are they going to find work? So this is the one statistic that becomes very personal and very emotional for people. And unfortunately in Alberta, it is going to be a bit of a tough sledding for a while. The reason we're not expecting the unemployment rate to come down very much in 2021, even though we are expecting some growth to come back, and we're expecting some job creation to come back, but there is a lot of surplus labor in the labor market right now. That 11.4% at the moment, that does not even account all of the people who are underemployed. In other words, you're working, but you're working far fewer hours than you need to be, or you're working in an industry that you're not trained for, or you're not suitable for. It also does not count people who are discouraged, people who give up looking for work simply because perhaps the industry they're in, they know there just really is no opportunity. So because that official 11.4% rate does not count the underemployed and discouraged workers, that means there's a lot of labor out there that needs to be absorbed. So even though we do see some growth coming back next year, some new job creation coming back, it's likely to take to 2022 or even beyond that until we get our unemployment rate back to single digits. So, you know, so far this has not been a very encouraging presentation, and I hope you're not regretting that you ever signed up to listen, because I think the news that I want to share next, it actually gets a little bit better. I want to talk about a few sectors of the economy that are actually doing okay. And in 2021, this is where we're expecting that modest 3.3% growth to come from. It's not likely to come from the energy sector. The energy sector, and I've used this metaphor before, so it might sound familiar, but the energy sector itself has shifted roles. It is no longer the growth engine in the province. It is now a backbone. So those are two very different things. Prior to 2014, the energy sector was the growth engine. It was what was creating a lot of employment directly and indirectly. It was bringing in capital investment. It was driving wages higher throughout all sectors of the economy. It was the growth engine. Now it is a backbone. In other words, we don't ignore it. We don't neglect our energy sector. We want to foster it. We want to make sure it's in the best shape it can. And we want to root on those oil prices to strengthen a bit. But we also have to be realistic in our expectations about the growth that the energy sector is going to produce, and that is going to be very, very flat. The sectors where we do think we're going to see some growth. The first is the technology and the digital sector. Now, there's been a lot of talk about the tech sector in Alberta, in all parts of the province, the Calgary region, the Edmonton region, maybe particularly. We're early days. We're not Waterloo, Ontario. We're not Vancouver. We're not Montreal. Alberta has its own tech sector, and it is growing, but we are sort of in the infancy stage of it. So while we do see some very impressive growth for the tech sector, again, it remains dwarfed by the energy sector, and we have to keep that in mind. But the tech sector and the digital sector, we think will produce some good growth and some good job opportunities in 2021. The other sector, the second sector where I'm optimistic, and you guys out in Wheatland County are sort of living and breathing this, is agriculture and agri-foods. Now, I'm always cautious, especially when I'm out in rural Alberta speaking to farmers. I'm always cautious in sounding too upbeat about agriculture because I know farmers and I know farming, and you are never more than 2 hours away from complete catastrophe. And I don't say that lightly. Farming is not for the timid of spirit. And it's always, there are always lots of challenges. That said, 2020 was not too bad of a year in many parts of the province for agriculture. Prices were generally okay, and yield was actually very good for wheat and canola. Again, I don't want to say every farmer had a good crop, but generally speaking, across the province, it was above average. But where I'm more excited than just the wheat, the canola, the beef, that's about 70% of farm cash receipts. And that generally is in pretty good shape at the moment. But where I'm more excited is that 30% of farm cash receipts are representing more diversified crops, things like cannabis, things like pulses and beans, things like vegetables, potatoes. All of those, I don't want to imply they're all new. I suppose cannabis is new. But all of them have been growing very nicely. And springboarding from agriculture is agri-foods. Now we're talking food and beverage processing. Now, in the decade leading up to COVID, food and beverage processing in Alberta was really kind of the silent star, I would describe it, of the province, growing very, very nicely, steadily, kind of behind the scenes, a lot of it at a small scale, not all of it. I mean, we have some very large vegetable processors, for example, down south. But a lot of the food and beverage processing has been small scale. It's been kind of micro industries, but it's been growing very nicely. And through COVID, I think it's accelerated, in fact, as people turn to even a greater appreciation for local produced food and beverage. So we think agriculture and agri-foods will be a leader in 2021. And also in 2021, we think clean energy technologies and renewable energy will also be a leader. And this is where I'm excited about our energy sector, because we're not talking about shifting away from hydrocarbons. We are talking about adding to hydrocarbons. And I think that is the only sensible way our province can think about our energy industry. It can't be either or, it has to be both. I'm a firm believer that we are going to be producing oil and gas in this province for many, many years to come. That said, I also believe that we are not far away from peak global oil demand, which means that we have to pivot. While we continue to be a hydrocarbon producer, we also have to add to that renewable energy sources and clean energy technologies. And the renewables, here's where I'm very excited about geothermal and hydrogen as two that I think Alberta has a lot of potential for. And I've been very pleased to see the provincial government's enthusiasm and some investments in those two sectors. But also, the wind, the solar, those as well. All of it, I think, will contribute to diversifying our energy sector. So those three sectors, clean energy and clean technologies, agriculture, agri-foods, and also the tech and digital economies, those are the ones that we are most optimistic about producing that growth. However, we have to always keep it in context. Even those three sectors combined are dwarfed by the energy sector, which is flat in 2021. So that is why we're expecting only that 3.3% growth. And even then, again, with the caveats that could put that at risk. Okay, so now what I want to do is shift gears and get back to the title of the presentation. What if it's easier than we think? This idea of adapting and evolving. Now, before I get into that, I want to be very, very clear. I am not for a minute suggesting that COVID has been easy for people. There are thousands, tens of thousands of Albertans who have lost their work, they've lost their livelihoods, many are losing their homes. Business operators are seeing their businesses threatened, and many have gone out of business. So, you know, I recognize that it is a very, very difficult time, especially for individuals and businesses. So I don't want to imply anything insensitive by this, what if it's easier than we think? Rather, what I'm thinking about is, what if adapting to new realities is easier for our province than we think it is? I'm going to share 3 stories with you this morning that help make that point. The first story is a personal one, and it starts in Australia. A year ago, my partner and I, in September and October of 2019, we took what for us was a trip of a lifetime. We went to Australia. We spent 2.5 weeks driving along the northeast coast, along the Great Barrier Reef. If any of you have been to Australia, or you might know, it is just a stunningly beautiful place to be. This shot was taken from one of our hotels. It's just impossible to, you know, even really imagine. But as you also know about Australia, it is full of dangerous creatures. There are sharks. There are spiders that will kill you. There are snakes that are poisonous, jellyfish and crocodiles at every turn. It just seems like Australia is full of dangerous animals and wildlife. But what I was afraid of in Australia, I wasn't afraid of the sharks or the jellyfish or even the spiders. I was terrified, though, of one thing: driving on the left side of the road. I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but I was absolutely terrified. The prospect of having to drive on the left side of the road with a steering wheel on the right side of the car. I practiced this in my brain before we went, and I thought, I just don't think I can do this. I thought it was going to be like trying to write with my left hand, because I'm right-handed. And I thought, if my driving in Australia is going to be anything like my left hand handwriting, you know, everyone's in trouble. So I was very anxious, very nervous about this idea of driving on the left side of the road. Now, I guess before I went to Australia, I had a few options. I could have petitioned the government of Australia, maybe the state government of Queensland, which is where we were. I could have asked them, would you mind reversing the lanes of traffic flow just for the 2.5 weeks while I'm visiting? This would be a great convenience to me, and it would actually be safer for everybody if, you know, you just reversed it to accommodate me. Well, obviously, that's a ridiculous proposition. I guess another option is I could have, when in Australia, I could have just driven on the right side of the road and avoided all of the oncoming traffic. You know, sort of damn the torpedoes, I'm going to drive with what makes sense to me. Obviously, that was not a sensible proposition. And the third proposition or option I had proved to be the least likely of all, and that is I could have just asked my partner to do all of the driving, 2,500 kilometers on this road trip. In fact, when we first got to Brisbane, we got the rented vehicle, the SUV, and he did the first bit of driving. And, you know, after about 4 hours, you know, he pulled over and said, okay, we're going to switch drivers. And I looked at him and he looked at me and he said, if you think I'm doing all of the driving on this trip, you better rethink that. So eventually I had no choice. I had to take the wheel on the right side of the car and drive on the left side of the highway. But what happened when I did that was actually something quite amazing happened. It turned out to be far less difficult than I thought it was going to be. And this sort of proves the truism about humans. We're amazingly adaptable when we need to be. But often, the fear of adapting is actually worse than the adapting itself. Now, driving on the left side of the road in Australia, I want to be clear, it required all of my concentration. I don't want to say it was easy. It was just easier than I thought it was going to be. I had to focus all of the time. In fact, when I was driving there, I was probably a safer driver, in fact, than I am at home, because you know what it's like most of the time, especially highway driving here at home. It doesn't actually require a lot of concentration. And this is in fact the problem, because you know that 1% of the time when you need to be concentrating, you might not be. You might be fiddling with a phone, or putting on makeup, or whatever people do when they're driving. And that's of course when accidents happen. In Australia, I had to focus 100% of the time on driving. But when I did that, the adapting to that new system, it was easier than I thought it was going to be. That's the first story. Now you might be thinking, okay, Todd, that's an interesting story about your holiday, but do you have any economic examples? Well, in fact, I do. Let's go back to another part of the world, the United Kingdom. In 1973, 1974, and some of you might even remember this. I was just a toddler at the time, so I don't remember. But there was a global energy crisis sparked by OPEC nations, which was they were constraining or holding back a supply of oil and creating petroleum shortages around the world, the United Kingdom including. And on top of a petroleum shortage, the UK was rocked by a coal miner strike at the same time, at a time when almost all of Britain's electricity was generated through coal-fired power plants. So it was an energy crisis. The UK, the British government responded with some very severe measures. They shut off every second street lamp in the country. They turned the heat and the power down on public buildings. They restricted television broadcasting. It had to end at 10:30 every night. And the most draconian measure, they went to a 3-day work week from a 5-day work week. Every factory, every office, every shop in the country had to close 2 days a week. They were only allowed to operate 3 days a week. So it was a 40% reduction in working hours. Now, you would think that on top of the coal miner strike, you would think that this 40% cut in labor activity, that this would in fact create a huge drop in economic output. But in fact, what happened was we did not see a dramatic drop in activity. That first quarter of 1974, when you go back and look at the numbers, there was a drop, but only about 10% drop in economic activity, not 40%, which is what you would think, given that it was 40% fewer working hours. Now, what accounted for this was British workers adapted. They figured it out. They adjusted to the new realities of a 3-day work week. They became more productive in those 3 days. They knew what work they needed to get done. So they made all these adjustments in the way they worked and what they worked on. And as a result, there was a drop in economic activity, but not nearly as large a drop as what you would expect. And that is because workers adapted. The third and final story I want to share with you brings us back to Canada, and a very unique industry that many of you will remember this. This is bar and pub receipts in Canada during the first decade of this century. So this data here goes from June 2000 to June 2010, the first 10 years of the century. And you see two distinct periods of time from June 2000 to roughly the middle of 2005, bar and pub receipts in Canada, they grew pretty steadily. This graph here, this is seasonally adjusted data. And by the way, the legend on the side, it doesn't start at 0, so it is a bit exaggerated. I should point that out. But we see basically a fairly steady increase till the middle of 2005, and then we see a very rocky period lasting from 2005 to 2008. A period of wild volatility where we see month over month, and again, these numbers are adjusted for seasonality, but we see big drops in revenues followed by the following month an almost equal increase in revenues, up and down. in a very volatile pattern. Now, some of you already have guessed what was going on in Canada between 2005 and 2008. And there was something very specific going on. At this period of time, Canadian cities and provinces were bringing in no smoking bylaws to bars and pubs. And this was staggered across the country. It didn't all happen at the same time. Toronto was the very first major Canadian city, and you see that very first spike down, a very sudden drop, because smokers, at least initially, they stayed home. If I can't go to the bar or pub, they thought, and smoke, I'm going to stay home. But you see what happens after the initial introduction of the bylaw is that after a month or two, most of those bar patrons, they come back. And the reason they came back is because they adjusted. They were adaptable. They recognized that, well, I kind of like being at the bar or pub. I just now understand if I want to smoke, I have to step outside. And in fact, most of smokers made that adjustment fairly easily. I don't want to suggest they were happy about it. I'm not a smoker, and I can't imagine them being happy about it. But the point is that they adjusted and they adapted to the new environment. Calgary was one of the very last cities in 2008 in Canada to bring in the bylaw. And you probably remember, I remember very distinctly in 2008, some of the bar owners and pub owners in Calgary, they were pleading in front of City Hall, do not do this. If you introduce a no smoking bylaw, I am going to go out of business because none of my customers are going to come if they can't smoke. But in fact, they made adjustments, and the bars and pubs may have even picked up new customers that avoided bars and pubs specifically because they were too smoky. And now they could enjoy that environment with some fresher air. This graph, I think, tells us two things. One is that we are more adaptable than we think. Those smokers can adapt and make adjustments. But the other one is this, that even though bar smokers did come back and make adjustments, it is not true to say that there was no impact. In fact, bar and pub receipts, they ended the decade slightly below where they started the decade. So there was a negative impact to bar and pub receipts because of the no smoking bylaws. It's just the impact was not nearly as significant or as negative as what was feared. With that, I want to end with this quote. There is a failure to recognize that not only problems, but also solutions can grow exponentially. This is from a book I read over the summer, and I'd recommend this to anyone if you need some really positive but really thoughtful kind of analysis of our economy and our society. It's called Humankind, A Hopeful History. But this quote here, I love this because it does not ignore the problems. It doesn't pretend that the problems don't exist. In Alberta, we've got some really serious problems, those in the energy sector, but also huge problems and huge uncertainty around COVID. So we recognize those. We don't imagine they don't exist. But at the same time, we have to focus on solutions, which can also grow exponentially. We are more adaptable sometimes than they think we are. The trick to adapting is we cannot focus on getting back to where we used to be. We can only adapt if we look forward and move forward and, in fact, embrace new industries, new ideas, and new attitudes. A lot of times we hear people saying we need to get our province back on track. And I understand, the sentiment in that, but it frustrates me when people say that because in some ways it was the old track we were in. That was the problem. We were too dependent on one industry and one commodity within that industry. But there's still a lot of, nostalgia. We need to get back to how we used to be. And I think as long as we are stuck in that mentality, adapting is going to be very difficult, probably impossible. However, if we look to forge new tracks in new industries and make changes to the way our economy works and operates, that's not always easy, but I think if we do that, adapting will be easier than we think. So with that, I want to thank you for listening. I'm going to unshare my screen here. Let's see if I can do this here. there. Am I back? Now, I think we've got 15 minutes or so for questions and answers.
Yep, definitely. Thanks, Todd. Yeah, it really strikes a resonance with me because of the, the same thing that you said on the end. It's like, if we wanted things to go back, let's say we were in the Dark Ages moving into the Renaissance, who wants to go back to the Dark Ages, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so with that, I'm gonna everybody on the call who wants to answer a question or ask a question, you can either type it in the chat and I'll ask it for you, or you can just unmute yourself and pose the question to Todd.
And I should just let you know, I'm going to have to duck out about 11:55 because I got to join Camrose for this very same webinar. So, but that gives us 15 minutes. So,
not a problem. Awesome. Thanks, Todd. Anybody on the call want to ask a question? No. I have a few myself. So, can I bring up what you mentioned in June, or is that going down a rabbit hole?
No, let's bring it up. I don't remember what I said, so yeah, let's bring it up.
Well, because the theme of that conversation was the 4 animals.
Oh yeah.
And you mentioned the grizzly. Do you still see the grizzly as where we potentially are going to reside through the winter, or do you fear another animal?
Yeah, so for those maybe who weren't on that call, the grizzly bear scenario, that's the one where in fact it's a dangerous encounter, but we avoid death because we in fact do the social distancing, we follow the protocols, and we don't see a second lockdown. The hippo was the other scenario where in fact we don't take the precautions and we get ripped to shreds. The hippo, of course, being the most dangerous animal in Africa, causing more human deaths. At the time back in June, I was saying pretty confidently that we were going to see a grizzly bear scenario play out over the rest of 2020 and into 2021. And I still think we are, but I do think compared to June, now here we are, October 20, I do think that hippo scenario is slightly more likely than it was back in June. In other words, I would say the hippo scenario is probably a 30% chance, and the grizzly bear, maybe the rest, the 70% chance. So on balance, I still think that we will avoid another lockdown and another recession next year. But we are seeing cases spiking, and we are seeing, people at times feeling frustrated and kind of ignoring the protocols around COVID. And that's what's making me a bit more anxious that hippo scenario could, in fact, happen.
Okay. I have a question here. What sectors are most at risk over the next 2 years?
Tourism, which is really sad, because back in February of this year, tourism was at the top of my list for a star performer in 2020. But it went from hero to zero, unfortunately, no fault of its own, but strictly because until that border is opened and we see, international travel resume, the tourism, the food and accommodation industry, they're in the biggest challenge for sure. Worse, I would say, than the energy sector, because the energy sector I would still just describe as flat, but the tourism sector is cratering. So it's probably got the biggest challenges right at the moment.
Okay. I have another question related to tourism. So what are your thoughts on the seasonal travel in tourism? And perhaps that's even, with the Albertan. So we had a discussion with Travel Alberta, and they said that actual winter was looking not too bad for the ski hills in the mountains for bookings coming from BC, Ontario, etc. But like you're saying, that's not a provincial thing. That's those popular hotspots.
Yeah. I would have loved to actually have listened to the person from Travel Alberta. I totally understand what they're trying to do, and it makes perfect sense. Like, we can't get the international visitors, so let's go after, Albertans and Canadians right in our backyard. And that's a good strategy. The challenge with that strategy is that the statistic I've heard from Travel Alberta is that for every one international visitor you lose, you've got to replace it with 5 domestic ones. And that's only because we do not spend as much. You know, most of us, if we're going to go out to Lake Louise or whatever, we're going to want a really, really good deal on that hotel room. You know, we're going to say, oh, look, we got a $99 a night deal at the Chateau Lake Louise for a weekend. And we might go. But we're probably not going to eat lavish meals. We're certainly not going to go there and buy a lot of clothes. You know, international visitors, that's just what they do. They come here, they buy a whole new ski outfit, from what I'm told. They stand at the base of the ski hill and get their photo taken to send home. Say, here I am skiing in Canada, and they don't even go up a lift. All of this is to say international visitors spend way more. And we do too. Like if any of us go to Europe or Asia or wherever we're going to go, we're going to spend more money than we do here at home. So yeah, you can replace those international visitors with domestic ones, but it takes a lot of domestic visitors, and we're pretty tight with our spending. So I'd say it's a good strategy. It's all they can do, but it's still going to be a challenge for them.
Okay. Well, we're definitely getting questions, so I'm going to try to pose them all and let you sort of hit them maybe
Sure.
with one answer. They sort of stream together. Question about the airline industry and if we cannot secure instant COVID testing, and then this is definitely going to come up, is the U.S. election, and how does that play with the Alberta economy and industry across Canada? And going more macro, do you see more migration coming from Americans, China, anywhere else in the world, based on probably our COVID numbers? And perhaps we're slightly, like you mentioned in June, we're not doing that bad compared to the other G8 countries.
Yeah, well, the whole question about the airline industry is fascinating because, you know, going back to February, here was a global industry that was expecting a record-setting year. And now it's been absolutely devastated, and there's not really any end in sight for a couple of reasons. One is their highest margin traveler are business travelers. You know, this is not the world I live in, by the way, but a lot of global business travelers, they don't care what it costs. They fly first class, they change their flights and pay those extra fees without thinking too much. All of that business travel is, at least for the time being, finished, because people are recognizing and businesses are recognizing, yeah, you don't need to go down a plane and fly to New York for an overnight, you know, for one meeting. You can do that on Zoom or on Skype or whatever. But then the other segment is the leisure travelers, the vacationers, who are much more price conscious, but they're not going to go anywhere if they have to quarantine when they get there or quarantine when they come home. So even once we get like a quick test, I think that will help. If you could do a 15-second test on everyone getting on the plane, that'll definitely help. But I think until demand comes back, that industry is probably 3 or maybe even more years away from really recovering. The question on the US election, yeah, who can ignore this question? What a fascinating time. And, you know, parts of me, I can't even allow myself to think about, you know, all the scenarios too much, because it tends to work me up in some anxiety, what could happen. But economically, you know, there is a part of me that says, well, for Alberta, Donald Trump, you know, he's been a supporter of the Keystone XL pipeline. I think he's on one level, far friendlier to Canada's energy industry. And at a certain level, I think that, you know, has been maybe positive for Alberta. But another big part of me says, well, hold on. If we look outside of our borders here in Alberta, and if Donald Trump is the only leader on our side, maybe that should say something to us, because certainly you're not going to find another leader outside of Alberta, maybe Saskatchewan, you know, but everywhere we turn, and it's not just Ottawa, it's everywhere we turn, east, west, north, south, there is political opposition to pipelines. That is the reality we live in. So Donald Trump, yeah, he's been a champion of Keystone XL, but I think there is still so much other opposition. Joe Biden, on the other hand, who looks like at this point, if the polls can be trusted at all, it looks like he's going to win. He's not been a friend of Keystone XL. In fact, he's been on record several times saying he's going to cancel the project, which he might. But, you know, I can't help but think if Joe Biden wins the election, that man has a lot on his plate. And I just can't imagine a pipeline coming out of Canada. You know, this is not going to consume his attention on day one in the White House. He is going to have so many other things to deal with, COVID among them. So if we're lucky, you know, he's opposed to Keystone XL, but if, you know, the project is going ahead, if we're lucky, he just kind of won't get around to canceling the project. He's also a pragmatic person. So he says he's opposed to it, and that plays well to his environmental base. But he also recognizes that, you know, unemployment in the United States is above double digits too. And they need jobs and anything that can get those parts of the country working again. So I'm not convinced that, I'm convinced he's not in favor of the project, but I'm not convinced he's going to cancel it right away.
So, the one thing on migration, but I'm wondering also too, based on what you said earlier, for our opportunities, if Biden was to win, he wants to take the U.S. into sort of that green energy play as well. Does that bode well for Alberta looking at green energy as part of their energy mix?
Absolutely, but only if we kind of embrace that and, you know, stop sort of dragging our feet and opposing this. And that's the way the world is moving. And I think we have a responsibility in Alberta to take advantage of that. And again, it doesn't mean either hydrocarbons or renewables. It can be both, especially when we look at hydrogen. We've got some real advantages, natural advantages in hydrogen production, I think, and geothermal. I think both of those could really play well for Alberta. And we could, you know, we could play into that Biden green energy solutions and some of the green energy policies in Ottawa, and we could leverage that rather than fight against it.
Okay, so how about the migration one? And then to chase that is, what about a Canadian election call this fall? And that will probably get you pretty close to 11:55.
Yeah. The migration. So we're talking international migration to Alberta or to Canada. Was that the question?
Let's go with Alberta.
Okay. Well, during even in the recession in 15 and 16, unbelievably, migration, national migration to Alberta continue almost uninterrupted throughout the recession of 15 and 16. COVID is a different case. This is a different kind of recession. Borders are closed. So obviously we saw international migration to Alberta dry up very quickly. And I think for the coming several quarters, it will remain very low. But eventually when COVID lifts, and that might be a year from now, but I'm confident that Alberta and Canada is going to continue to see, you know, positive in-migration numbers from places like China, other parts of Asia, maybe parts of Europe, maybe even the United States. You know, we could start to see a bit of that reverse brain drain. I know anecdotally, some families have moved back to Canada, not because they can make more money here, but they're just kind of tired of the madness down there. So a lot of things could happen, but I do see, you know, a year from now, 2022 and beyond, more positive for international migration to Alberta. And then the question about Ottawa, and maybe I'll wrap it up there. Yeah, who knows what's going to happen there? It sounds, you know, these days like the Conservatives, okay, we've got our leader in place, this whole you know, scandal. They're kind of pressing the government on that. It sounds like they kind of won an election or want an election. Justin Trudeau, I'm not sure if he does. just because we're in the middle of a pandemic, I hope we're not thrown into an election. I look at, our friends east of the Rocky or west of the Rockies in BC. They're being asked to go to the polls during a time when everyone's also being told stay home. So for the sake of Canada in our pandemic, I hope we don't see a fall election. But that's not to say we couldn't see one in the spring or maybe fall of 2021.
Okay. And with that, Todd, I'd like to totally thank you for coming back again. I'd actually like to ask you back again after you see how the U.S. election shakes and maybe give us some insight at that time.
Yeah.
That would be a really interesting conversation as the world would be changing around us.
Because I'm not traveling these days, my time is actually more flexible, unbelievably. I mean, I'm speaking in 5 minutes to cameras, but I don't have to leave this chair. So by all means, if you want after the election, maybe December sometime, I'd be happy to come back and do another one of these chats with you, but let me know.
Perfect. Thanks again, Todd. And thank you for everybody else attending this session and listening to Todd's insight. I always appreciate him sharing time with us. And thanks again, Todd. And we'll talk
thanks,
soon.
Patrick. Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.